Hello everyone, welcome to the Fountain of Life podcast. Welcome to today's episode. For the past couple of episodes, we have been looking at lessons from the public ministry of Jesus to help us to understand some of the truths that Jesus showed us or he teaches in the Gospels. And today we want to look at a very interesting subject. I'm sure all of us at some point, we look back at our lives, we look back at what we are doing in God's house, and we feel that God owes us something. We feel that maybe we deserve more from God. We get transactional. If I do this, you do that. And sometimes we also look at other people in the service of God and think, look, I'm doing far better and doing much more, in God's house. But how come I'm not experiencing more from God, more blessings, more that, compared to other people who in our mind may be doing less? Do you feel that way sometimes? And you get into the whole transactional vibe with God? Maybe you are not alone. There may be many more who feel that way. This is your host, Charles Zuta, and I welcome you to today's episode to discuss the generosity of God.
Lord, you are the fountain of life, restorer of my soul. I worship you today. Lord, you are the fountain of life, restorer of my soul. I worship you today. Lord, you are the fountain of life, restorer of my soul, restorer of my soul. Worship you today. Lord, you are the fountain of life.
You see, Jesus put out a parable to help us to understand what the kingdom of God is like when it comes to this whole issue of effort and reward. And if you don't feel that way, maybe you haven't really looked at your faith in the house of God. I heard people several times say, Lord, I've done so much, I'm doing so, but now look at me. Let us go into the scriptures as we address the generosity of God and put that thought and that feeling to rest. In the book of Matthew, chapter 20, verse 1, Jesus put out this parable. That's a parable of the workers in the vineyard. And this is what he said. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. Now when he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And he went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace and said to them, you also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right, I will give you. And so they went. And again he went out about the sixth and the ninth and did likewise. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing idle and said to them, why have you been standing here idle all day? They said to him, because no one hired us. He said to them, you also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right, you will receive. So I'll pause here and let's talk a little bit. So Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like. So anytime I'm reading the Bible and I get to parables like this, where Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like, my heart jumps for joy, because he begins in those parables to peel back the layers to help us see how the kingdom of heaven operates. We are still learning. We are still trying to understand what our Father's kingdom is like. So when we get these truths, it's really exciting because we get to really understand. You don't need anybody to interpret, because you know that this is the principle. This is how heaven operates. So he likens the kingdom of heaven to a farm, a vineyard owner who licenses a landowner. I'm not going to qualify this. It's a landowner who goes out to hire day laborers, into his field. And he starts, let's say, at 6 in the morning. He goes in and he meets the laborers. He agrees a wage for them, a denarius. And I think the denarius, like the daily wage, of, let's say, a typical Roman soldier or something like that. So it is a reasonable minimum wage, and they agree on it. Okay. Then he sends them into his field to work. At 9 in the morning, he goes back and finds another group of people. He hires them as well. But if you note carefully, those second batch, he didn't negotiate any wage with them. He just tells them, go into the vineyard and I'll give you whatever is right. And they took that deal and they went also. Then at 12 noon, he does the same thing. And at 3 p.m., he does the same thing. And at 5 p.m., he goes to the same place and found others. And then he hires those as well. The day ends at 6 p.m. Okay. So we have this, group of workers, 6 a.m., 9, 12, 3, and then 5. If you note very carefully, the last group who went in, he also said the same thing. Go to the vineyard and whatever is right, you will receive. So from the 9 to 5 p.m. group, they had no contract. I wonder how many of us will agree to take a job without signing an agreement, any contracts of any kind. But that is what happened. Those workers somehow were trusting in the word of this landowner. The only people in the sense who were secured, who had any kind of contract and agreement, were the first group. Everybody else just had a verbal understanding that you'll be paid. And it's payment that is going to be based on an attribute of whoever is hiring them. So let's see what happens at the end of the day. Remember, those people who were hired at 5 p.m. only worked for 1 hour. So logically, there should be some proportionality in terms of the payment. Okay? By human understanding, by human feeling in our minds, that is what should be the case. Right. So verse 8. So when evening had come, the owner of the vineyard said to his steward, call the laborers and give them their wages, beginning with the last to the first. That is the 5 p.m. crew who had only worked for 1 hour. Let's pay them. Start from there and work backwards. Okay. And when those who were hired about it, and he gave them their wages, beginning with the first to the last. Verse 9. And when those who were hired about the 11th hour, they each received denarius. But when the first came, that is the 6 a.m. crew, they supposed that they will receive more. And they likewise each received, a denarius. And when they received it, they complained about the landowner, saying, these last men have worked only 1 hour. Fair enough. And you made them equal to us who have borne the burden and the heat of the day. But he answered one of them, saying, friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go your way. I wish to give to this last man the same as to you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with my own things? Or is your eye evil because I am good? So the last will be first, and the first last. For many are called, but few are chosen. If you look at this parable carefully, through human eyes, or through our natural senses, it might seem unfair because the first group negotiated for 1 denarius and they went in to do the day's work. And then if you compare to the last group, they went in at 5 p.m. and worked for only 1 hour. And they also got 1 denarius. So was it wrong on the part of the people who have worked for 12 hours to complain? Maybe yes. They may have a point. But the legality of it is that they are getting what they negotiated. They negotiated 1 denarius. So in a lot of ways, even though they felt they deserved more, they were under a contract. And the contract stated 1 denarius for the day's work. So technically, the landowner hadn't done anything wrong. You see, when Jesus told this parable, he had certain audience in mind. The 6 a.m. group were practically symbolic of people who were under the law. They had a set of contracts to perform. So when Jesus was dealing with the Pharisees, he was dealing with the people under the law, he always had to navigate this issue of entitlement. They felt they were the ones who deserved more of God. They had all their rituals. They had all their services. They had the laws. They had the prophets, a sense of entitlement. But you see, Bible says that grace and truth came through Jesus. The law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus. So Jesus' main mission is, let's fulfill the law, but let's also move on. Let's open the door to grace. What is grace? Grace is unmerited favor. Getting what you really don't deserve. So anybody else outside the law is purely under God's grace. And that clear distinction is what Jesus is bringing out here. That is, whilst the Jews had a deep sense of entitlement, that we have served God the longest, we have known this Jehovah, we have been with him, he is our God. Jesus, by this parable, is saying, okay, that is true, you have your contract, but there are these other people as well who have the same entitlement as you, even though they may not have been in the service of this Yahweh since Moses or since Abraham. And that is a hard saying, or that is a difficult thing for a lot of religious people to understand. That under grace, God moves away from legality. He moves away from that sense of entitlement to a place where he gives as he pleases. So, at the beginning of this episode, I was asking you, if at some point in your faith, you felt that, you know what, I'm doing so much more. I live righteously. I do all these things. And yet, look at me. And yet, this sinner, somebody who had just lived his life anyhow, finds God and suddenly the person is flourishing. And it doesn't seem fair to us. That was the mindset Jesus was dealing with the Jews. In Matthew chapter 19, the Bible says that Jesus had this discussion with Peter when Peter said, "We have followed you all this while. What is in this for us?" So Jesus tells them everything that is going to happen and plus. Some theologians feel that this parable is also addressing that issue that Peter raised. We have been with you, we've given up homes, we've given up everything. What is in this for us? So, primarily, if we come before God, this side of grace, our feeling should not be transactional. We shouldn't look at ourselves and think that, well, I'm doing so much for God, so proportionally I deserve XYZ. Not to be transactional with God. Because under grace, he does as he pleases. Let us look at a typical example and then we shall come back to this. That is, we being able to see God's grace and God's goodness the way that he had purposed for us. And that is so important for us as believers. So from the macro perspective, the global perspective, we find biblical Jews and current Jews having that sense of entitlement that Yahweh is for them and them alone. Unfortunately, they are missing out on the truth of grace. Recently, I saw a video, about, some Orthodox Jews that were spitting at Christians. And you sit back and wonder, this is that spirit of entitlement. That who are you? You have no right to this God. He is our God. We are the 6 a.m. crew. We signed a contract. But the bottom line is this. God has other sheep that are more than this flock that you have. And we need to embrace the act of grace. That God hired other crews, using the language here, that are purely rewarded on the basis of God's grace and his generosity. If you go with me to Ephesians chapter 2, the Bible will say this: for by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. So the 9 a.m. crew, the 12 p.m. crew, the 3 p.m. and the 5 p.m. crew, thank God, they have been saved by grace, because the landowner said, come work in my vineyard and I'll give you as I please. So it's important for us to realize that yes, we are going to deal with those feelings, whether on a personal level or on the church level, where we feel like we are the one who are more deserving because we think we've done more. But remember, whatever we have, whoever we are, it is a gift of God. We can never earn a wage with God. So our salvation, everything that we have in God, is not of ourselves. He came to the marketplace. He came looking. He called us. Jesus said, I called you. I chose you. I called you. John 15. That you will go and bear forth fruit, and your fruit shall abide. So he came looking for us. He brought us in. So whatever we expect of God is purely a gift from him. We have no sense of entitlement. There's no contract in us that we should go and enforce with God. So you compare the 5 p.m. crews, 1 hour of labor, and yet they got the same denarius. That is how the kingdom of heaven operates, by grace and God's generosity. I would rather embrace God's generosity than get transactional with God. I want to respond to God's love for me in my service in his house. Lord, I'm not doing this because I expect you to do this. No. I want to always move away from the transactional. I throw myself at your grace. I want to just respond to your goodness to me. I expect nothing. If at the end of the day, I don't get anything, I'm just happy to serve you, Lord. You see, so that is the response to grace. We embrace it with gladness. And that is so important. In a very fascinating situation, Jonah had the same feeling. Now let us move away from, the Jews and the Christians kind of thing, the 6 a.m. and the rest kind of conflict. Let us look at the personal one, on a personal level. There will always be people that will know, who in our minds don't deserve, what we think they are getting, because maybe they spent their entire life, on the broad ways of life. And then maybe on their deathbed, they accept Jesus Christ. And they have the same salvation as those of us or those of the church who were believers. They've lived righteous and holy throughout their lives. Are you going to say that is unfair? Imagine the thief on the cross. He'd been a robber, he'd been a bandit all his life. But on the cross, he had paid no tithe. We never knew that. Maybe he never even led a soul to Christ. He never defended the gospel, nothing. But on the cross, Jesus told him, today you shall be with me in paradise. And I'm sure you are wondering, gosh, how fair is that? That is the grace of God. The grace of God goes where it's unmerited. But we are told in Jonah chapter 2, Jonah had experienced a very, very amazing, move of God. God called him, but God gave him a task that, Jonah, you know what? Go to the city of Nineveh, a very wicked and evil city, and preach the gospel. Tell them judgment is coming. And then I'm sure Jonah looked at himself. He being a Jew and seeing all the many things perhaps he might have done for God and all of that. He said, what? These people are evil. They deserve to die. They deserve your judgment. Why should I go talk to them? So he began to flee from God, and run away. He wouldn't go. But we all know what happened. Eventually, God made him willing. And God has his own way to make people willing. Like some old song says, he doesn't compel us to go. He just makes us willing. And his methods we can never understand. But somehow, Jonah was broken in the belly of that fish. So in Jonah 2 verse 9, this is part of his surrendering prayer. But I'll sacrifice to you with a voice of thanksgiving. When we come to the place of thanksgiving, when we are in a hard place, like Jonah was in the belly of a fish, at the bottom of the sea, that is a hard place. When we come to that place and we lift up thanksgiving to God, we are ready for our deliverance. So when he offered that thanksgiving, it's a sign of surrender. It's a sign of embracing God's will for that moment for his life. But one thing in that prayer which is important that I want to draw our attention to is the last verse that says, salvation is of the Lord. So Jonah must have known that God is a God of salvation. So why wasn't he ready to extend that salvation to the people of Nineveh? Let us look at his reasoning in Jonah chapter 4, verse 1. So Jonah went to preach, the people repented, and God relented of the judgment that he had intended to come on Nineveh. Verse 1. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he became angry. You see, so if you compare Jonah's attitude to the 6 a.m. crew, you have the same feeling. Why was he angry? Jonah should know that salvation belongs to God. But what Jonah didn't understand is the generosity of God's heart and the goodness of God's heart. The act of grace, where God sends mercy ahead of judgment. That was a lesson he would later learn. So in his anger, Jonah prayed. Verse 2. So he prayed to the Lord and said, Lord, was not this what I said when I was still in my country? Therefore I fled previously to Tarshish, for I know that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, one who relents from doing harm. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it's better for me to die than to live. You see, it's hard to kick against the pricks, like the Bible says, kick against the thorns. So Jonah is speaking the truth, but his heart can't relate to the truth. He said, I knew this. I knew this. That is why I was running away from you. I knew that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, who relents from doing harm. You see, so Jonah was seeing the picture of the 9 a.m., the 12 a.m., the 5 a.m. crew, but his attitude was one of the 6 a.m. crew. We have borne the brunt of the whole day in the sun and working, and yet you want to pay us the same way, like somebody who's worked only 1 hour. It was so hard for Jonah to take that he said, you know what? I can't live with this. It's better I die than this. But of course, God is not going to do that. So God asked Jonah in verse 4, then the Lord said, is it right for you to be angry? That is the question that we all need to understand. Is it right for us to be angry? When we look at others who we think aren't serving God so much, yet God is blessing them. I've heard with my own ears people in their conversations being bitter and angry at God. I know what I served you. I did this, I did that, and now look at this. I have been praying and wondering and asking, and nothing is happening. That is not the attitude that brings the breakthroughs that we want. In the kingdom of heaven, we receive gifts from God. We can't be transactional with God. We embrace His grace. Why? Because God is generous. He does as He pleases. Remember in His conversation with the laborers, the people who were complaining, the people who were angry, He said, can't I do as I please with my own? And I like that. Verse 15 of Matthew 20 says, is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with my own things? Or is your eye evil because I am good? And I like God's attitude towards the people. God didn't kill Jonah for being so obstinate, for being so, entitled. He was generous and explained to him what he wanted to do. So in the same way, in Matthew chapter 20, verse 13, this is what the Bible says. But he answered one of them and said, friend, I am doing you no wrong. He was even explaining himself, and he called the person friend. You know what? Even when we feel bitter, we feel angry, God is not angry with us. He understands our frustration. You see, he called the person friend. His friend, I am doing you no wrong. That is the heart of a father. He's generous. He understands. In our dealings with God, child of God, let us move away from that feeling of entitlement and rather throw ourselves at the generosity of God. If you maybe read the story of that thief on the cross and you feel so embittered, I'm serving God all these years and God is not promising me paradise, and yet somebody on his deathbed, God says today, you see, we all have our plans. It says, God has called us for His purposes. Let us do what God has called us to do. Do it with all our heart and leave the world to God. Let God be the one who judges. We may never understand God's value system. He only gives us glimpses of it, like this book, where He says the first are good. That is how the kingdom works. Thank you so much for joining me today. God bless you. And I pray that you will serve God with an open heart, without any feeling of entitlement, but in appreciation of the gift of God that you have received. Let us all embrace the generosity of God. God is good, and He knows how He apportions His gifts and His blessings. Thank God that we will be under grace We'll continue to look at lessons on the public ministry of Jesus Christ. Next episode. God willing, come your way, the things that God has done in terms of the lessons that we learn in Jesus Christ. So join me next week as we look at lessons on the public ministry of Jesus Christ. And if you haven't already subscribed, I encourage you to. There are so many important topics that we are treating that is going to be of value to you. And also, you can download the audio version and start alone as the others and all the places where you get your episode. God richly bless you. See you next week.
Fountain of my life, I worship you today. Lord, only you are. Yes, Lord. You restore my soul. I worship you today. Yeah.
The book of Matthew 11:28-29. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest